What were the cheap, affordable dinner that kept black families nourished in the 1960s? These dinners turned humble scraps and basic staples into hearty plates that filled bellies and brought families together. They showed how, with a little ingenuity and resourcefulness, even the most modest ingredients could create something satisfying. If they could make so much out of so little back then, what's stopping us from doing the same today? Mustard greens with salt pork was a dish that embodied both thrift and tradition. While collard greens were a beloved favorite, when money was tight, mustard greens could fill the pot just as well. With their sharper bite and quicker cooking time, they became a dependable meal. My grandmother would simmer the greens slowly with scraps of salt pork, allowing the fat to melt into the broth and infuse every leaf with flavor. The kitchen would fill with the earthy, smoky scent, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could be transformed into something rich and comforting with the right seasoning. The best part, as she always said, was the broth, what some called pot liquor, where all the flavor gathered. She would soak up every drop with cornbread, ensuring nothing went to waste. This was a meal that brought families together around the table, a dish that could stretch what little meat there was into a hearty meal. Salt pork, cheap because it was mostly fat, added depth and warmth to the greens, making them feel like a complete, satisfying meal. In the 1960s, mustard greens with salt pork wasn't just a side dish, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work and carrying heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, yet one of the most memorable. A pot of rice was always affordable and filling, and when paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was more affordable, sold in large tins that seemed to last forever. Families would pour it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains, making them shine with a rich, smoky sweetness. The taste was deep, just enough to make children smile, and it was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared. The meal would carry families through the night, providing the energy to face the next day. My grandmother used to say that rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, a perfect example of how resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when black families had to stretch every dollar, rice and molasses became a way to keep hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born out of need, yet remembered with love, a reminder of how a little creativity could turn basic ingredients into something special. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a southern staple that graced tables no matter how tough times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and could be dried to last through seasons, making them a reliable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother would simmer the peas slowly with onions, and if there was any left, a scrap of pork, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Alongside, she baked cornbread crumbly, warm and perfect for soaking up every bit of the broth. Together, these two dishes made a full meal that was hearty enough to sustain the family after long days of hard work, whether in the fields or at the factory. Field peas, though humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, carried a comforting, earthy taste that reminded families of the land. This pairing was a dependable meal, stretching across generations as both a necessity and a point of pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread-filled stomachs warmed hearts and reminded everyone that simple food, when made with love, could still be good food. Giblet gravy over rice was a perfect example of how nothing went to waste in the kitchen. While chicken itself could be expensive, the innards, the gizzard, liver, and heart, were often cheaper or even given away by butchers. My grandmother would take these often overlooked parts, chop them into small pieces, and simmer them in broth, creating a savory, rich gravy that would fill the entire house with the smell of a Sunday meal. Once thickened, she'd pour it over rice, transforming what could have been a small handful of giblets into a hearty, filling dish that could feed the whole family. The rice soaked up all the flavorful gravy, stretching a modest amount of ingredients into a meal that could easily serve 6 people. Some children might have turned their noses up at it initially, but hunger and the comforting warmth of the dish quickly taught them to appreciate its flavors. The taste was bold, savory, and deeply comforting, and my grandmother always said, Giblet gravy proves that dignity doesn't come from the quality of meat, but from the care with which it's prepared. In the 1960s, giblet gravy over rice was a meal that helped families get by on lean night, turning simple, inexpensive ingredients into a dish full of warmth and sustenance. It was a testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families who could take what others might consider scraps and turn them into something satisfying. It wasn't just a meal, it was an act of making the most out of what you had, a tradition passed down from generation to generation. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together in no time, made from what the garden and pantry could offer. Fresh ears of corn, or canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. The real magic came from the lard or bacon fat, which brought out the flavor, sizzling until the onions turned brown and the corn caramelized. The sweet, smoky aroma filled the house, offering a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, quick, and nourishing, a simple yet satisfying supper that was perfect for families stretching what little they had to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, allowing the juices from the skillet to soak into every bite. The beauty of the dish was in its simplicity, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something far greater than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet was a reminder that even with limited ingredients, you could still create a meal full of warmth, flavor, and comfort. It spoke to the resourcefulness that was needed in tough times and the joy of creating something delicious out of what you had on hand. Fried bream with hush puppies was a meal born from rivers, ponds, and the knowledge of hands that knew how to fish. Bream, small and plentiful, were inexpensive, costing little more than the time spent casting a line or tossing a net. My grandmother would clean the fish, roll them in cornmeal, and fry them crisp in hot oil until the skin turned golden brown and crackled. Alongside the fish, hush puppies, small cornmeal fritters, bubbled in the same oil. They were quick and easy to make, using ingredients that were simple and affordable. Together, these made for a dinner that felt rich without breaking the bank. Families would gather around the table, dipping the hush puppies into hot sauce or enjoying them plain as the fish cooled. The taste was pure Southern tradition, simple, salty, and tied directly to the land and water that provided the meal. In the 1960s, with grocery store prices rising, fishing poles and cast nets became the means to provide for families with little to spare. Fried bream with hush puppies was more than just food. It was a testament to the resourcefulness and tight-knit communities where everyone helped gather the catch of the day, ensuring that no one went hungry. It was a celebration of simplicity and the satisfaction of meals made with care and togetherness. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that showed just how powerful homegrown vegetables could be in making a meal. Pumpkins were easy to grow, easy to store, and provided enough to feed a family for weeks. My grandmother would peel chunks of pumpkin, cook them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned into a thick, savory stew. The natural sweetness of the pumpkin would blend perfectly with the sharpness of the onions, creating a balance that felt both hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she would add a bit of pepper or leftover bones for extra flavor, but even in its simplest form, the stew was filling and nourishing. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household, even without meat or expensive ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins weren't just for pies or special occasions. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into filling suppers that could stretch across several meals. The stew embodied warmth, thrift, and the creative use of whatever was grown in the garden. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival didn't have to mean sacrificing flavor. It was a reminder that, with a little care and imagination, you could make something satisfying from what the land freely gave. It was a true testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of families who knew how to make the most of what they had. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was a dish that turned cheap vegetables into a hearty meal. Turnips, which were easy to grow and often given away by neighbors, had a strong, earthy flavor that softened when boiled until tender. My grandmother would ladle the hot turnips into bowls, topping them with crumbled cornbread that soaked up the savory broth, turning it into a satisfying supper. It was simple, but it kept bellies full on nights when meat was a luxury, and it showed how a little creativity could transform a humble vegetable into something nourishing. The slight bitterness of the turnips was mellowed by time and seasoning, while the cornbread added both body and comfort. Children might have grumbled at first, but there was never any room for waste, so they ate their fill. In the 1960s, this dish was common in homes that relied on ingenuity to stretch ingredients and make do with what was available. It wasn't fancy, but it had dignity because it represented survival, proving that even in tough times, food could still provide warmth and satisfaction. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs wasn't just a meal, it was a reminder of resilience, resourcefulness, and the importance of making the most of what you had. Chicken wing stew was one of those meals that might surprise people today, considering that wings are now a prized part of the chicken. Back in the 1960s, however, chicken wings were the cheapest cut of meat, often bought in bulk when they could be found. My grandmother would take those wings, pile them into a pot with onions, celery, and carrots, and let them simmer slowly. The wings would give up their fat and flavor, turning a thin broth into a rich gravy. She would then thicken the broth with flour or cornstarch, creating a savory sauce to pour over rice or bread. It was a messy meal, but no one ever complained because the flavors were so comforting. Wings may be a delicacy now, but in those days, they were the overlooked scraps transformed into a meal that could feed a family. My grandmother always said that every part of the bird had value if you treated it with respect. Chicken wing stew was a perfect example of thrift, turning something that others dismissed into a meal that filled the house with warmth. It proved that good cooking wasn't about the price of ingredients, but the love and patience that went into preparing them. In the 1960s, this dish was a staple that helped families make the most of what they had, turning modest ingredients into a fulfilling, comforting dinner. Pork cracklin' cornbread was a dish that made even the simplest pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, the crispy bits left behind after rendering pork fat, were inexpensive but packed with flavor. My grandmother would fold these cracklins into cornbread batter, letting the fat melt and the crunchy bits scatter throughout every slice. When it baked, the cornbread came out golden, rich, and with a texture that plain cornbread could never match. The salty flavor of the pork balanced perfectly with the sweet cornmeal, making every bite indulgent despite the dish being made with low-cost ingredients. Families would slice the cornbread thick and eat it on its own, or serve it alongside beans, greens, or stews, allowing the flavor of the cracklins to enhance the entire meal. In the 1960s, pork cracklin cornbread made families feel like they were enjoying something special, even during tough times. It was a dish that turned thrift into joy, proving that simple food, when made with care and creativity, could be more than just sustenance. It could be a celebration. The spirit of making do with what you had, combined with a little imagination, transformed even the humblest ingredients into something to be proud of. Fried rice with scrambled eggs was one of those quick suppers that could be made from almost nothing yet still felt hearty and satisfying. Leftover rice from the previous meal was saved and then reheated in a skillet with a bit of oil or lard. A scrambled egg was added to give richness, and sometimes my grandmother would throw in chopped onions or green peppers from the garden if available. But even without extras, the dish stood strong, with the rice frying up golden and the egg binding everything together into something more than just leftover grains. A dash of salt and pepper finished it off, and often hot sauce appeared on the table for a little extra kick. What amazed me was how something so simple could fill a family and stretch ingredients without breaking the budget. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled eggs wasn't a fancy meal, but it was dependable, offering warmth and nourishment when times were lean. The meal reminded everyone that you didn't need meat or expensive ingredients to make something filling. It was a dish that satisfied both children and adults, keeping spirits steady and hunger at bay with just a few humble ingredients. Fried rice with scrambled eggs became a staple that carried families through busy nights, proving that even the simplest meals could provide comfort and nourishment in equal measure. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that perfectly blended frugality and comfort, a meal that stayed with families for generations. Okra, a vegetable often grown right in backyard gardens, was simmered in a pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick, hearty stew. My grandmother would then mix up a simple cornmeal batter, dropping spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, letting them puff into tender dumplings. The okra itself naturally thickened the stew, giving it richness and body without needing expensive ingredients like flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy, sustaining, and nourishing, while the dumplings filled the stomachs of tired workers after a long day. The dish was straightforward, but packed with warmth and energy. Over time, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings became a fixture of daily life. It wasn't just a meal, it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, this dish represented both thrift and ingenuity, taking humble vegetables and flour and turning them into something everyone at the table could be proud of. It was a dish born from the land, full of history and resourcefulness. Butter beans and rice was another go-to meal that fed families through tough times. Butter beans, with their creamy texture, were slow-cooked until tender, often enhanced with a smoked ham hock or a bone if one was available. The smoky flavor from the ham would infuse the beans, creating a rich broth that poured beautifully over a bed of rice. My grandmother always used long-grain rice, which helped stretch a pot of beans into enough servings to feed everyone in the household. The result was a hearty, nourishing meal that filled both the stomach and the soul. While butter beans were cheap compared to meat, they were packed with protein, offering a way to make sure families stayed strong without breaking the bank. Children learned to appreciate the softness of the beans and the deep flavor of the broth, and adults understood the value in using simple ingredients to create a satisfying meal. Butter beans and rice weren't about extravagance, they were about practicality. It was a meal that turned basic staples into something comforting, something to look forward to after a long day. In the 1960s, this dish became a story of resilience, showing how resourcefulness in the kitchen could make even the tightest budget go further. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk was a dinner that captured the sweetness found in the simplest of meals. Sorghum syrup, a cheaper alternative to sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever. My grandmother would bake the biscuits using basic ingredients like flour and lard, items that could be stretched across multiple meals, and once the biscuits were fresh from the oven, she would drizzle them generously with the syrup. The warm, flaky biscuits would soak up the syrup, and she'd serve them with cold milk. Simple but filling, this meal provided the energy needed to get through a hard day's work. The sweetness of the sorghum syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something special, even though it was just supper. In the 1960s, when meat was scarce and meals had to be made from what was on hand, sorghum syrup biscuits with milk reminded families that comfort didn't always require expensive ingredients. It was about making do with what you had, finding joy in the simplest things, and turning them into something memorable. It was a dish that showed how, even during hard times, a little sweetness could soften the edge of hardship, filling the home with warmth and love. Ham bone soup with vegetables was a perfect example of how to stretch one small piece of meat into a hearty meal that fed many. A single ham bone, often stripped of most of its meat, was simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth became rich, smoky, and flavorful. My grandmother would add any beans or greens she had on hand, letting the flavors meld into a dish far more substantial than the ingredients alone might suggest. Families would gather around steaming bowls, dipping slices of bread into the flavorful broth and savoring the deep, savory taste that the ham bone had imparted. It was a meal that embodied frugality at its finest, taking something as simple as a leftover bone and transforming it into something nourishing and satisfying. In the 1960s, when meat was often too expensive to be eaten in large quantities, a ham bone was a centerpiece for a meal that could stretch across an entire family. Ham bone soup with vegetables was proof that with patience and care, you could coax incredible flavor from even the humblest ingredients. It was a meal that carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful, a true example of resourcefulness and the heart of Southern cooking. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a classic Southern dish that combined tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, picked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden and crispy in hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, a simple cornmeal dish that stretched across countless households for just pennies. The tangy, crispy tomatoes contrasted beautifully with the soft, warm grits, creating a meal that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food straight from the garden and pantry, with no need for expensive additions. Families often ate it in the summer when tomatoes were plentiful, but it was enjoyed year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal proved that good food didn't depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Fish head stew was a dish born from necessity, yet it held surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice, allowing every ounce of richness to be extracted into the broth. My grandmother always insisted the fish heads made the stew better than fillets, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned thick and hearty. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, transforming scraps into a filling supper. The taste was earthy, strong, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should ever go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift, creativity, and gratitude. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Homemade cornmeal pancakes for supper were another example of how families stretched simple ingredients into a hearty meal. Flour, cornmeal, lard, and milk came together to form a batter that fried into golden cakes on a hot skillet. My grandmother would stack them high, drizzling syrup over the top when available, or serving them plain with butter when syrup was in short supply. The pancakes were both fluffy and filling, providing enough energy to last a family until morning. They cost next to nothing, but could feed many, which was exactly what mattered most. Children loved the sweetness when syrup was added, while adults appreciated the filling substance of the cakes. In the 1960s, cornmeal pancakes became a staple when meat was scarce, turning humble ingredients into something both warm and reliable. It was comfort food born from necessity, one of those meals that stayed in your memory long after the times changed. Homemade cornmeal pancakes carried the spirit of thrift, filling plates with love and a sense of survival. Pork fatback and cabbage was a skillet dish that showed how even the cheapest cuts of pork could bring life to vegetables. Fatback, mostly fat with little meat, was rendered down in a hot pan until it sizzled, releasing rich flavor into the cabbage. My grandmother would slice the cabbage thin and cook it until tender, letting the cabbage soak up the savory richness of the fat. The result was a smoky, savory dish that was surprisingly filling, despite being made from ingredients others might consider undesirable or cheap. Families often paired it with cornbread or rice, stretching it further into a full meal. It was food born from thrift, yet it carried a taste that lingered long after the plates were cleared. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage served as a reminder that flavor didn't come from abundance, but from the care and knowledge of how to cook with what you had. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance, proving that even the humblest ingredients could be transformed into a meal that satisfied both the body and the soul. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the most resourceful ways to turn leftovers into a comforting, filling meal. My grandmother would gather whatever vegetables were left over from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmer them in a simple gravy. Then she'd pour the mixture into a dish and cover it with biscuit dough instead of the usual pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried the essence of thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen went to waste. The biscuit crust added substance, transforming the dish from a side into a full dinner. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was a common meal in homes that relied on creativity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival wrapped in comfort, a dish that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic, fitting perfectly into the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of using expensive white potatoes, sweet potatoes grown in the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would take whatever was left, beef, chicken, or even pork, chop it small, and cook it with onions, carrots, and peas until it formed a savory base. The mashed sweet potatoes formed a golden layer on top, balancing the salty meat with a natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to feed the whole family, but inexpensive enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes, plentiful in many southern gardens, were filling, rich in flavor, and stretched farther than most vegetables. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just a meal. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still managed to put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden topping represented thrift, care, care, and the resilience of families who could turn humble ingredients into a satisfying, nourishing meal. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that made the most of every scrap. In the 1960s, chicken backs were the cheapest part of the bird, with little meat on the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth became rich and flavorful. The long cooking time softened the meat, allowing it to slide easily off the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and satisfying. Families would serve the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the meal even further. Sometimes my grandmother would add a ham bone or a splash of fatback for extra flavor. But even without, it was still nourishing and delicious. What made this dish so memorable was how something so overlooked could feel like a dignified, satisfying meal. Stewed chicken backs taught families that no part of the chicken should go to waste. Even the smallest scraps could form the base of a meal that nourished both the body and the spirit. It was a dish born from patience, thrift, and creativity. A reminder that even the least expensive parts of the bird could still provide warmth, comfort, and pride at the table. Cornmeal dumplings, salon de mar, tomato broth were a dish that felt simple yet satisfying, blending both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a dash of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother would mix cornmeal with flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, which she dropped carefully into the simmering pot. As they cooked, the dumplings softened, soaking up the tangy tomatoes and thickening the stew. The aroma alone brought everyone into the kitchen, the combination of corn and tomato promising a hearty meal without needing any meat. Cornmeal, a staple in black households across the South, was cheap and always on hand, while the tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from homegrown harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they made a meal that cost almost nothing but was filling enough to warm hungry stomachs. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two humble ingredients into a comforting family staple, proving that with care and resourcefulness, frugality could produce meals that were both memorable and satisfying. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion were another way to stretch garden vegetables into a filling, satisfying meal. Bell peppers, inexpensive when in season, were stuffed with seasoned rice, onions, and sometimes a bit of tomato, with meat being optional or absent altogether. The rice itself provided enough substance to make the dish complete. The peppers were baked until tender, with their skins slightly blistered, while the rice absorbed all the flavors. Each stuffed pepper was perfectly portioned, making it an ideal meal for both children and adults. The scent of roasting peppers and onions filled the house, signaling comfort even when the budget was tight. Despite being made from humble ingredients, stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion had an impressive look and feel, showing that presentation mattered too. It was a dish that combined thrift with pride, proving that even in tough times, a meal could be hearty, healthy, and beautifully served. Barbecue pig ears were a dish that showcased the deep roots of thrift and tradition in black cooking. Pig ears, among the cheapest cuts of meat, were often discarded or sold for pennies at butcher shops. My grandmother would carefully clean them, simmer them until tender, and then finish them with homemade barbecue sauce that clung to each bite. The texture was chewy but flavorful, and when paired with cornbread or greens, it became a meal that carried both satisfaction and cultural heritage. Families would gather around plates of pig ears on weekends or special occasions, treating them as a delicacy despite their humble beginnings. The smoky, tangy sauce added rich layers of flavor, turning the simple cut into something special. Eating barbecue pig ears was about more than nourishment. It was about making something from nothing and honoring traditions that valued every part of the animal. In the 1960s, dishes like these kept families connected to their heritage and traditions of survival. Barbecue pig ears turned scraps into a meal that was cheap but full of memories and flavor. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers was a dish born out of necessity, but it was also a testament to creativity and resourcefulness. My grandmother would gather whatever vegetables remained at the end of the week, beans, carrots, peas, corn, or turnip greens, and simmer them in a pot with broth. Sometimes she'd add rice, pasta, or potatoes to make the soup even heartier, turning a few leftover ingredients into a meal that stretched well beyond what you'd expect. Each batch had its own unique flavor depending on what was on hand, but it always felt like home, hearty and comforting. Cornbread would be served alongside, crumbled into the bowls to soak up every bit of the flavorful broth. It was a way to make sure nothing went to waste, turning what others might discard into a nourishing, satisfying meal. In the 1960s, families relied on meals like this to carry them through tough times, turning the smallest scraps into a full and filling dinner. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers wasn't just a meal. It was a reflection of the ingenuity and love that kept families going, even when resources were scarce. It was survival wrapped in comfort, one pot of warmth, pride, and nourishment shared around the table. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps was one of those meals my grandmother made that turned simplicity into something special. Hot water cornbread was quick and easy, just cornmeal mixed with boiling water and fried into golden patties that crisped perfectly on the outside. It was cheap, filling, and appeared often at the table. To go with it, she fried up the fish scraps, bits of fish tails, heads, or the thin pieces left over from a larger catch. What others might discard, she transformed into a meal, seasoned and fried until crispy. Together, the cornbread and fried fish scraps created a meal that cost next to nothing but still filled everyone up. The cornbread added a smoky richness, and the fish scraps brought flavor and protein. It was a meal born from ingenuity and resourcefulness, showing that nothing went to waste if it could be eaten. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps carried the legacy of thrift, turning what others overlooked into a satisfying dinner. It wasn't just about the food, it was a lesson in survival, proving that with a little creativity, you could make a meal out of almost anything. Turnip green pot pie was another perfect example of turning simple ingredients into something hearty and filling. My grandmother would cook down turnip greens with onions and broth until they were tender, then pour the mixture into a dish and top it with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust became golden and flaky, soaking up the savory juices from the greens. It looked like a Sunday supper, but it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families would slice into the pot pie, finding warmth and substance in every bite. The greens, once thought of as a side dish, took center stage as the main course. Served with cornbread or beans, it was a meal that could stretch across the table and feed the whole family. In the 1960s, dishes like turnip green pot pie were a testament to the resourcefulness that kept families going. It proved that with a little care and creativity, even the simplest ingredients could feel like something special. Turnip green pot pie wasn't just food, it was pride, showing that hard times didn't mean you had to give up on flavor or comfort at the dinner table. Share your favorite cheap dinner in the comments. Hit like if this made you hungry, and subscribe for more stories straight from the heart of the kitchen.